time now for our media show Scoop, and we look at Israel and Iran. While the two countries fight each other, they're also battling for our hearts and minds, locked in an information war, trying to win approval, to rally support, and to demonize the other. On June 16th, Israel's defense minister said that Iran's state television and radio were, quote, about to disappear. Hours later, this happened.
You can see that news anchor left the desk as debris shot out into the studio there. Iran condemned the attack on the television building, calling it a war crime, and called on the UN Security Council to take action.
CBS News reporting there. Now, one Iranian journalist and one media worker with the state-owned broadcaster died from their injuries in that strike. CNN visited the aftermath.
I'm standing in the atrium right now, but if you look around, this whole area has been completely destroyed. All of the offices, all of the technology that they have inside here, the broadcast technology, everything has been rendered pretty much useless. What we see here is the actual studio where an Iranian state TV anchor was sitting and reading the news when the strike hit. You can see here that is an anchor desk right there.
And after that deadly strike, Iran threatened Israel's Channel 12 and Channel 14 news stations on the same day as the strike in the Iranian capital. Benjamin Netanyahu gave an interview to America's ABC News. Pro-Trump media are split on what the president should do over the war. Take a listen.
You mentioned the support of the American people. There are some prominent supporters of President Trump who say that the United States should not be involved at all. Let me give you, for example, Tucker Carlson, of course, has been close to President Trump for quite some time, speaks to him frequently. He said the United States should not at any level participate in war with Iran. No funding, no American weapons, no troops on the ground. There is another option. Drop Israel, let them fight their own wars. What do you say to those supporters of President Trump?
This is a threat to the entire world. It's a threat to Israel, as I said, to our Arab neighbors, to Europe, to America. They chant death to America. It's though this is not your business. This is not myopia. This is utter blindness. I mean, sometimes you have to take a stand against evil.
And Netanyahu has the ear of U.S. media. On Sunday, he'll be giving another interview, this time to America's most watched news network, Fox. Now, Middle East historian Dr. Asal Rad posted on social media about the language of manufacturing consent. Israel, preemptive strikes. Iran, escalation. Israel warns. Iran threatens. Israel targets. Iran attacks. Israel has a right to self-defense. Iran has a right to condemnations. Israel has a sophisticated military with nukes. Iran has a nuclear threat without nukes. How much journalists question authority or how little can tip the scale? And there have been some awful tragic stains in our industry, like not pressing George W. Bush on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And some accuse our industry of fueling the Balkans war by selectively omitting or diffusing certain information. For more, let's cross to London and speak to Mark Seddon. He's a former UN correspondent for Al Jazeera and a speechwriter to UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Hello to you, Mark. Each country trying to obviously get the upper hand in the information war, Israel and Iran. What have you noticed?
Well, I think it's really important for everybody to try and stand back and look at what we are seeing and making our own minds up. I mean, I think it's very much the case in the West that certainly for the past 20 months with Gaza, there's been a sense of omission, a sense of trying to catch up sometimes, a reality, for instance, that Israel will not allow any journalists into Gaza. So essentially the world has had to rely on many brave journalists, and at least a couple of hundred of them have been killed by Israel. So we're seeing a situation, I think, when some very, very basics are being ignored by much of the media. And I think it's possible. I'm trying to be generous and kind, actually, because I think I think it's been very difficult for people to believe in some of the things that have been said at the outset of the war in Gaza and what we're hearing now in Iran. And I'm thinking in particular of words such as the Dahir Doctrine, for instance, which essentially has been talked about by Prime Minister Netanyahu and many of us other ministers. It's a doctrine really to remove large-scale destruction of civilian infrastructure to destroy an enemy and its support for it. We also have the Hannibal Directive, the talk of Amalek. Now, Amalek is essentially a way of describing a biblical command to annihilate. Now, all of this seems so extreme, so bizarre. I personally, as a journalist, never thought that I would see what I've now seen in Gaza, and also the justifications for what we're seeing now in Iran. So there's catch up. There's also, I don't know, I think an awful lot of journalists haven't got out of that mindset of simply believing whatever the authorities in the West tend to tell them is true when it comes to the military, for instance. So weapons of mass destruction. I was on those marches back in the beginning of the Iraq War. 1.3 million people in London. And we said that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And the media told us that it did. And so did much of the political class. We're back in similar terrain, and we need to be very skeptical.
Right, Mark, I'm just wondering also, I mean, like headlines, of course, can skew the public's perception, either accidentally or intentionally. A couple of ones here on the screen that I'm showing to our audience. Starting with one the day after Israel's unprovoked attack, the Times ran, quote, "How does Israel defend against Iran's missiles?" Then this week, the New York Times ran, "Will Israel's interceptors outlast Iran's missiles?" Are those headlines fair? Are they impartial? Or are they taking sides in the conflict?
Look, I mean, you know, the first casualty of war is truth. Impartiality is something that we would love media to strive towards more. The BBC here in Britain makes great claims of it, but I think the BBC has really genuinely been wanting these past 20 months for some of the reasons that we were talking about. I think when it comes to the United States, there's kind of a complete block, really. I mean, I can understand personally why there is media hostility and hostility towards the Iranian regime. I don't particularly like it. But at the same time, you cannot really talk about self-defense and Israel, as those media headlines were, when Israel has just attacked Iran, and US national intelligence was saying just in March that it had no evidence that Iran had any nuclear weapons or was planning to build them in the immediate future. So we had this extraordinary situation whereby, for instance, I wonder how many in the Western media have ever heard of the Samson option. And I mean, most people haven't, and it's because the media won't tell you about it. They talk about a nuclear program in Iran, which might lead to nuclear weapons, but they don't talk about the nuclear weapons, the chemical and biological weapons that Israel has had. And there is an option, the Samson option, to use them if Israel is attacked.
Yeah, Mark,
so we
on
have
that,
two nuclear powers actually in the Middle East.
Yeah, sorry. On that note, I just want to bring in the Soundbite. Your former Al Jazeera, another former Al Jazeera journalist, Mehdi Hassan, has since moved on to found Sateo. Listen to what he had to say about international media.
Iran is the victim here, Israel is the aggressor, but in the Western media coverage, Israel is the victim always. Some other points you may miss while watching Western media coverage, for example, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Israel does. Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Israel isn't. Iran has allowed IAEA inspectors into its country. Israel doesn't.
Yeah, Mark, Mehdi Hassan calling that a double standard.
Well, I think it is very clear that it's a double standard. And I think that perhaps the difference between now and earlier times is that people are much more aware of all of this. And actually, it's people sit at home if they're still watching some of this media. And I think people have actually, for instance, I mean, I do see in Britain people's lack of trust in the BBC has grown enormously. And I've always been a great supporter of the BBC. And it worries me, actually, because I really do think that the BBC and other mainstream media are really, really important. But I think they have so failed because, I mean, I was challenging the BBC's defence correspondent just the other day who produced a very interesting piece comparing the Iranian military with the Israeli military as kind of a Samson versus Goliath piece, of which we're very familiar, but which failed to mention the nuclear, chemical and biological weapons that Israel has and that Iran doesn't. To be fair to him, he said, well, I was in a rush, I should have done it. But, you know, we see this time and time and time again. And for what it was worth, back at the beginning of the Iraq War, I was a member of the British Labour Party's National Executive Committee, and I was shown a dossier, along with other members of our executive, by Tony Blair, purporting to show that Iraq had missiles that were capable of hitting the British bases in Cyprus within minutes. Now, this dossier turned out to be a complete manufacture, complete manufacture. And yet the media at the time reported it as fact. The media at the time reported Iraqi weapons of mass destruction as fact. They don't exist. Now, this time, of course, everybody knows that Iran doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, so we must pretend that they could be about to get them, and we must ignore the fact that Israel already has them. But more profound than all of this, and more important, I think, is because some of the media and some of the political class have allowed really no real proper focus criticism on Israel and its conduct of the war in Gaza, that essentially Israel has been allowed to rewrite the rules for there to be no rules at all. So, you know, you can threaten a head of state, another head of state. I don't remember that ever happening in my lifetime before, of killing a head of state, as President Trump and the Israelis have. You can kill medics, you can kill journalists, you can bomb hospitals. Both sides are bombing hospitals now, we see. This is where we're going, because we're not holding our leaders to account properly, and we're not reporting the news accurately enough.
Right, and I'm wondering if part of it is just how we frame it, if it's careless, if it's sloppy, or if it's agenda-driven. This piece on the New York Times, it's a list of the generals and nuclear scientists that Israel has killed in its strikes. Now, on first glance, you might think nothing of it, but we must remember those scientists are civilians, and if there are threats, the nuclear scientists in any other country could also be threats, possibly. Does a piece like this run the risk of normalizing civilian deaths?
Oh, well, I think absolutely. And of course, the normalization of civilian deaths is that literally 100 people a day, more or less, or around about that number, are being killed in Gaza in these so-called Hunger Games, where they rush to try and get aid and are often killed doing so. So we have seen the normalization there. But the point that you make there is very, very powerful, because yes, Netanyahu has himself said anybody can be assassinated. The German Chancellor has said Israel is doing our dirty work for us. Possibly the most disgusting thing I've actually heard from a Western politician in my life was that. So yes, it's the normalization, and it means, I mean, we shouldn't get too carried away. But what runs through this is that anybody is a target.
Right.
It could be one day you or me.
Right.
If they don't like what we're saying.
Right, Mark. And in terms of not getting too carried away, I'm just wondering about some of the comparisons to past conflicts. In The Guardian, Owen Jones wrote, quote, "The warmongers were wrong about Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. Now watch them make the same mistake about Iran." Now, you've already touched on this a couple of times, but how valid are those comparisons when we look back to a war like Iraq?
Well, I think they're very valid. I mean, we had the BBC's Global Affairs editor, John Simpson, yesterday asking a question about Russia and Iran, and referring to Iran as a client state of Russia. And my point to him was, well, if Iran is a client state of Russia, is Britain a client state of the United States? So the use of language is very, very important. But look, the Iraq war and the Iran war, there are all sorts of similarities, except that this time around, nobody can pretend that Iran has weapons of mass destruction. It may now decide to try and get them. Possibly that was their intention. We don't know. But since when has war been declared on the basis of a possible intention to do something? Especially since, as you know, as you referred to, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is signed by Iran. So I think that the situation is in many ways quite similar, but also a little bit different. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the United States was determined to try and get international support for its attack on Saddam Hussein, and so it went to the United Nations Security Council. This time, there's no mention of the UN Security Council whatsoever. And this time, of course, we are seeing the media spending a huge amount of its time trying to work out what is happening inside Donald Trump's big brain.
All right, Mark.
And we're not altogether clear if Donald Trump knows what's happening inside his own brain, but it would appear that Donald Trump is the one who might decide to either go in with Israel and attack Iran or not, depending on which side of the bed he gets up on in the morning.
All right, Mark, we ran out of time. I'm sorry.
We're in a very dangerous world.
We ran out of time, but I would thank you so much for being our guest this week on Scoop. Mark Seddon joining us from London. Real quickly, that brings us to our quote of the week. It comes from the Committee to Protect Journalists. They said that Iran's conflict with Israel has intensified media censorship in the Islamic Republic, with Iranian journalists warned not to comment online, and a task force set up to prosecute those sharing, quote, fake news. In Israel, Palestinian journalists covering the conflict with Iran that began June 13th have been accused of working for the enemy, barred from reporting sites, physically assaulted, and subjected to racial slurs. That's it for this edition of Scoop. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned to France 24.